Asian economies weighing fresh uncertainty after US President Donald Trump announced a flat 15% tariff on imports. It follows a Supreme Court ruling that struck down the president's sweeping Liberation Day tariffs, casting doubt over previously negotiated trade deals. US Trade Representative Jamieson Greer has assured that existing agreements will remain in force, adding that none of Washington's trade partners have indicated plans to withdraw. The new 15% levy is set to take effect tomorrow and will remain in place for at least 150 days. Now, China says it is assessing the impact and has urged the US to lift unilateral tariffs weeks ahead of Mr. Trump's planned visit to Beijing. A current trade truce has US duties on Chinese goods at 10%. Now, South Korea says its trade deal with Washington remains valid, and it will continue consultations to maintain what it calls a balance of interests. Seoul is also monitoring possible refunds of the now voided tariffs. Meanwhile, over in Europe, lawmakers say the EU will freeze its trade deal with Washington following the Supreme Court's ruling. Now, the bloc had earlier pressed Washington to honor agreements reached last year, insisting that the deal must be respected. India has reportedly delayed sending a delegation to Washington to finalize an interim trade pact, citing renewed uncertainty. New Delhi is assessing the implications of the US Supreme Court ruling on its bilateral deal, which would have cut US tariffs on Indian goods to 18% in exchange for India purchasing $500 billion worth of American products over 5 years. And for more on this story, Ishan Garg is reporting for CNA live from New Delhi, and Nick Harper also joins us live from Washington, D.C. Now, let's start with Ishan first. Ishan, can you talk us through how New Delhi has reacted to the news so far? And does the Supreme Court ruling give it more scope then to renegotiate its deal with Washington?
Well, India's finance ministry says that it is too early to say what the impact of these new tariffs will be on the Indian economy and exports in general. But India's finance minister, Nirmala Sitharaman, did say that India's commerce ministry is certainly assessing the impact of the new ruling and the new 15% tariffs that have come in. Now, in terms of what this does to US-India trade negotiations, for the in the short term, we are seeing a kind of a disruption because Indian negotiators were supposed to leave from New Delhi on Monday to go to the US and carry out 3 days worth of talks where they were supposed to finalize the legal frameworks of a trade pact. India and US had agreed on a trade framework, not signed it yet, but had agreed in principle, under which US was supposed to drop tariffs on Indian imports to 18%, and in exchange, India would open its markets to more imports from the United States, which would have included things like some machinery, electrical products, and limited amounts of farm goods as well. But those trade talks were predicated on the idea that US was earlier imposing 50% tariffs. Now those rates have come down to 15%, and that's why experts here in New Delhi, as well as India's opposition parties, are saying that India should get US back on the table and negotiate a fresh trade deal. But there are also experts in India who say that New Delhi should look and watch what is happening in Washington, especially as there are more cases opened up in American courts over the principle on the basis of which President Donald Trump has brought in the 15% tariffs as well.
Ishan, thank you for that update. Now let's head over to you now, Nick. The US Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, as we heard earlier, insists that the existing trade deals remain intact. But how credible is that assurance, given the recent developments? And also, how could that possibly impact ties going forward with its trading partners in Asia?
Well, Angela, the US has a huge credibility problem at the moment because here it is trying to present itself from a position of strength, trying to reassure trading partners that those trade deals are intact. But simply put, no one really knows what's going on. And in the background, they know that the US president can change his mind, change the tariff rate on a whim. If we look back at the last couple of days, on Friday, the Supreme Court struck down the majority of those tariffs that the US government had put in place. A few hours later, the US president imposed a 10% rate, and then on Saturday, he increased that to 15%. I mean, he can change things as he wants. And I think trading partners around the world will be looking at that, wondering what might come next. Jamieson Greer, in his comments over the weekend, said that the president had been campaigning on tariffs and protecting American industry for many years. He said that policy hasn't changed. So making it clear that tariffs are still a central plank of the US government's economic but also foreign policy. So they intend to continue with those tariffs. But those trade deals are not just in jeopardy, but they are in a state of confusion. And we have some very significant meetings coming up over the next few weeks with top Asian trading partners. The US president will be welcoming the Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi here to the White House in the middle of March. And then Donald Trump will be heading to Beijing to meet China's leader towards the end of March, beginning of April. And I think those meetings, when we get to that point, there might be some clarity. But at this stage, it's a little hard to predict exactly where we'll be, even just in a few days, let alone a few weeks from now.
Yeah, and speaking of a few days, Nick, we know US Customs is saying that they will halt the collection of the struck down tariffs starting Tuesday. So can you tell us more about this? And what does that mean then in more practical terms for businesses who, quite frankly, feel a bit thrown off at this point?
Yeah, Angela, that deadline of starting the new tariffs on Tuesday, the 15% rate, will now coincide with stopping the old tariffs. So it seems that the Trump administration doesn't even want a 24-hour period in which they are not collecting import duties for goods entering the United States. But they are not saying anything about those refunds, potentially hundreds of billions of dollars now owed to countries around the world, but also US companies that have imported those goods. The US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent really demurred over the course of the weekend when he was asked on a couple of occasions. He gave an assessment that it could take months to litigate all of it, and he pushed this away from the administration towards the courts. He said it was up to the lower courts to work out what comes next, how those refunds would work. Again, it's a case of really no clarity at this point, at a time when consumers and companies here in the US are clamoring for those refunds. But the Trump administration is making it clear that they are not in a hurry to pay back that money.
Nick, thank you so much for that report. We have Nick Harper reporting live for CNA from Washington, D.C., and Ishan Garg live from New Delhi. An uncertainty over the latest twists in President Trump's trade policy is weighing on markets. Gold prices climbed. Dollar and Bitcoin dropped after Trump imposed a new 15% tariff. Despite a lack of clarity on tariffs, the prospect of lower rates lifted Asian equity markets. Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index jumped 2.5%. South Korean shares notched a record close, led by gains in chip makers and automakers. Equity benchmarks in India also logged gains. But market analysts see more volatility ahead as the renewed tariff uncertainty unnerves investors.